Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be pitting two giants of prog against each other in a prog celebrity deathmatch. So today I'm going to be putting King Crimson up against Yes, and we're going to find out who the best one is. Now, last week I did a video where I put Frank Zappa against Mavish Orchestra, and I didn't really do it, I just chatted about the way they'd work together and stuff like that. And that video's done really well, so I thought this is what you lot want. You want to see conflict. So I thought, let's go for it. And I thought, I don't want it just to be based upon my opinions. So over the weekend, I have been in my laboratory and I have been creating a new machine. Now, some of you will remember last year, I created the Prog-O-METER, which was a device that would detect whether something was prog and how much it was prog. Now I've created a new machine called the SUPERI-O-METER, and we can put two bands into that, and then it will score each band on 10 parameters, right? Either one wins or lose. It's just win or lose, completely 1 or 0, and then out of that we'll be able to determine which band is objectively the greatest out of those two bands. Because this is using maths, and maths is always true, we will have the objective, and it won't even be an opinion, the objective fact of which of these two bands is the best by the end of this video. So I'm going to switch on the SUPERI-O-METER in a minute and feed these two bands in. If you want a serious discussion about Yes and King Crimson and why I picked those two bands and the relationship between the two, stay to the end of the video, because I will talk more seriously for those who want a serious video. But for those who just want some silliness, or just to come here because that's such a clickbaity title and they want to support their band like a football team and see who wins, then I'm going to get straight in to finding out which one's the best. So I'm going to feed in the bands now. I'll just do that now. Right, so it's feeding in now. Hang on, it takes a while to get going. Am I going to have to switch it off and on again? Oh, yeah. There we are. There. So they're in and ready to go. So let's look at the first parameter. So the first parameter that the SUPERI-O-METER measures bands by, or artists by, is innovation. Right? So in these two bands' cases, there's a clear outright winner here. Yes, very innovative band on the progressive rock genre, but King Crimson on that first album, In the Court of the Crimson King, pretty much defined what prog is, to such an extent that they actually influence Yes and their direction. Then in 1972 they reformed with the Bill Bruford John Wetton lineup and again redefined prog. Then in the 80s they came back with three incredible albums, Discipline, Beat and Three of a Perfect Pair. Now Yes did come back in the 80s with 90125, and I give them points for that, but I think, looking at pure innovation, I think King Crimson win out. So we're going to give a point to King Crimson there. Now we're going to move on to technical ability, skill. This is a very important thing amongst prog fans. They like to judge a band on how good they are playing. Both these bands are exceptional musicians. Yes stuff is very long form, very complex. There's all sorts of changes. And of course King Crimson is known for the sort of dictatorial autism of Robert Fripp. And I think that's been the driver for the band sort of collapsing. So the technical requirements of each band is absolutely incredible. I can remember reading an interview with Patrick Moraz when he joined the band, and he went down to a number of rehearsals with Yes, and he was shocked at their ability to sort of almost like improvise these incredible passages on the spot. So I think in terms of technical ability, I think this is a draw. So the SUPERI-O-METER has come out with half a point each for that one. Right, now the next one on the list, the next parameter is charisma. Some bands are incredibly charismatic. If you think of a Led Zeppelin, it's so much about what they look like and their whole image that they put out. And in Yes and King Crimson, we do have two quite charismatic bands for prog. I think Robert Fripp is almost like the anti-charisma. It's the way he operates is so un-rockstarish that he goes around the circle of charisma and is in fact magnetic. You know, he sits down on a chair with his little round glasses on. It just has one spotlight above his head, and he sits there and calmly plays the music. And I think that is such an important feature of the band. They have always messed with their lineups. You know, if we think of the sort of 80s King Crimson, which was all sort of guitar and drums and synth, but we've got like Ballou, we've got Robert Fripp, and then we've got Tony Leppard on Chapman Stick. That was an incredible visual thing. And I can remember watching concerts on the TV when I was young of Bill Bruford coming out and playing all these drum things with Adrian Ballou. So that they knew how to put a show on. Of course, Yes also know how to put a show with their incredible sets, you know, performing in the round. And I think they also have their charismatic musician, which of course was Chris Squire. I think Chris Squire was a magnetic personality on stage. What was he, 6'10" or something, striding around with that big Rickenbacker and the long capes. And I think there's an argument that Yes could pinch this. So remember that Yes could pinch this, but I think the Superi-O-Meter anyway has come up with a 0.5. Oh yes, it's just put a message out that said Jamie Muir in the 70s with all that chain throwing and all the makeup and bizarre stuff was so far ahead of anyone else in prog. You know, Jamie Muir was probably the most avant-garde musician ever to work in a mainstream prog band, and so that's why it's given it half a point each. So I accept that. So we're now going to move on to composition. This is the fourth one on the list. Now, I think both of these bands created long-form compositions. I think on Lizard, when John Anderson performed on Lizard, he saw the long-form compositions that King Crimson were making on that album, and that inspired him to go back in. And on the Yes album, we suddenly see, or is it even Time and the Word? I might not get it right, but we suddenly see these long-form compositions, and Yes becomes sort of the grand master of the long-form composition, ending up with Tales from Topographic Oceans, which you could argue is one huge long composition. And Yes had to solve the problem, but influenced by King Crimson, had to solve the problem of how you make a track that's 20 minutes long. Both of these bands did it actually in different ways. King Crimson would often do it by implementing improvisation into the compositions. If you take something like Starless and you took out the solo sections of that, it suddenly shortens. But they have still created on that track a very strong structure where you have themes introduced at the middle and you go on a journey and then you return back to the themes. Yes, we're brilliant at taking actually quite small musical information. John Anderson would come up with incredibly beautiful melodies, but they were very short. You know, it's almost like he just got the hook and nothing else. It's like the ultimate pop band. But what Yes would do, especially once Rick Wakeman joined the band, is he was able to arrange these into flowing compositions by using a classical technique of stating that theme in different contexts. So I think again here I would not like to give a point to either one, and the Superi-O-Meter has agreed, and they get half a point each. Right, so we move on to the next criteria now, which is production. Right, so production is the quality of the recordings and also what they achieve in the recording studio. King Crimson again pushing the studio to its limits, and that connection I think with Fripp, with Brian Eno, who is one of the great prog producers of all time really, gives King Crimson a lot of credit. But I feel that the way Yes created their albums, which are basically stitched together by Eddie Offord, you know, they would improvise and they would create these like multi-track tapes, and then they would cut them together. There's a famous story of I think when they were making Close to the Edge, where a very important section was picked up by a cleaner and stuck in the bin, and they had to go and rustle around the bins to find that bit of tape and sellotape it all together. And I think if we take the sort of groundbreaking stuff that the Beatles did on Sgt. Pepper, Yes took those ideas and they pushed it to the absolute maximum. When we listen to something like Close to the Edge now, in this modern world of Pro Tools technology, we can't quite perceive how incredible that was to make in a studio without computers, with just probably a 16-track machine, maybe a 32-track machine. But I think in 1972, even 16-track machines were rare. They were in 1970, without a doubt. I think that's the first time we saw a 16-track machine was in 1970. So 2 years later, they're creating something like Close to the Edge. And the way that must have been made is they must have made a lot of sub-mixes. So they were creating mixes and then cutting those together. So the album had to be mixed and work as you went. This is a remarkable thing. It's always baffled me how Yes did this. It's an incredible achievement. And their ability to perform correctly in the studio. Because back then a lot of these bands were playing all at the same time. And the sound's incredible. So I think I would err towards Yes in terms of production. Also, I think 90125, when they come back in the 80s, rather than just conforming to that 80s production, what they did with what's his name from the Buggles, Trevor Horn, was groundbreaking again. I think that 90125 may be the greatest example of 80s production at its best. So, Yes get a point for production, and King Crimson don't. Let's move on to the next criteria. Influence, right? Both bands incredibly influential. You know, some bands can be innovative, but they don't actually influence the bands around them at the time. The influence happens later on, or it doesn't happen at all. They get rediscovered. In the case of both these bands, they both influence all sorts of bands. But I think it's quite obvious that King Crimson, coming out as they did in 1969 with that first album, really created the genre, and everybody started to follow their way. In 1972, when the second album came out, in 1972 when Locks, Tongues and Aspic came out, they were really laying the groundworks for progressive metal before Rush really came in and did that as well. I think their albums in the early 80s, you know, which is that sort of Talking Heads mixed with prog, mixed with Steve Reich and Gamelan, all that sound, which is now a definitive type of progressive sound, that's also hugely innovative. So I think in terms of influence on music, I think King Crimson have it. So they get the point for that. The next criteria is called presentation. So this is about the sort of imagery that the band created. King Crimson always had that very dark imagery. The first album, that cover is an absolutely... it's just one of the great covers in progressive rock or in music altogether. After that, there's some great artwork, but we never really ended up with a logo. We never really ended up with a look. So King Crimson get points for that first album and how iconic that is. But Yes almost like created the visual look of progressive rock, right? And you see it all the time. You'll see a progressive rock festival, and when you look at the artwork, it looks like Yes. You know, I mean, Roger Dean, his influence is so important that if we look at a film like Avatar is like walking into a Yes album cover, isn't it? And that's the biggest film in the world. So I think visually, that logo, incredible album covers, starting with Close to the Edge. No, Fragile. Start with Fragile, Close to the Edge, Relayer, Tales from Topographic Oceans, Drum. Those are all incredible album covers, and that logo, and just the influence of Roger Dean. I think, of course, Yes are going to get the point for presentation. So that's what we have for that one. We've got 3 more to go. So next one is record sales. How many people like these bands, right? So this is unequivocally going to go to Yes. Yes's album sales absolutely dwarf King Crimson's album sales. Yes have sold in the millions and millions, 30, 40 million. I don't know the figures offhand. I didn't look it up because I knew that King Crimson's sales, if you actually look at them, are relatively low for a classic 70s prog band. They really came out with that first album, and that first album was a big success and it sold really well. But actually then King Crimson, in terms of sales and popularity, stall. And they find themselves within couple of years opening up for Yes, having to do those American tours to try and make their name. By the time they get to 1974, they're just on the verge of moving into the same sort of stratosphere as Yes, and of course Robert Fripp, breaks the band up to go and join that sort of commune with J.G. Bennett, studying the esoteric knowledge and processes of Gurdjieff. So Gurdjieff could well be to blame for King Crimson not going to a sort of that level, but would they? Was the music just too dark, to cross over? Maybe they just didn't have the hooks of Yes, but in any way, the way it is that Yes have sold in the tens of millions. I think it's something like 40 million albums off the top of my head, but you can go and check that out. So of course they get the point. Yes, get the point. Right, so that was sales. Right, the next one is called the great to crap ratio. Right, so some bands make a couple of great albums, the rest are all rubbish, and it's all based upon that one album. I'm thinking like Guns N' Roses, bands like that, that have gone down in legendary status. When we really look at it, there's only a few good albums there. The rest are pretty rubbish. Yes are almost like a definitive version of that. Yes come out in 1968. They make a run of some of the greatest progressive rock albums ever made. After Drama, and Drama's a great album. Then they change their style. We get 90125, and I would argue that's the last great album by Yes, which came out in 1984, which is nearly 40 years ago. After that, they've just turned out one album after the other of sort of inconsequential albums. There's that whole Union fiasco, and Anderson, Wakeman, Bruford and Howe, and all that stuff that goes on. You've got Big Generation, which doesn't quite hit like 90125, and then we get about 30 years of albums that I cannot recall or remember. They've just come out with this new album, which is supposed to be Return to Form. It's not a Return to Form, so I think it's obvious to this. However, if King Crimson ever did release any stinkers, and I can't think of any, I'm not so keen on Islands and Lizard, I'm not so keen on that period, but those albums are so important and influential, and are really sort of creating that, almost like that Canterbury scene, and that whimsical English sound that then Fripp moves against, but actually informs bands like Yes. So it's King Crimson is just a stream of incredible albums, probably down to sort of Robert Fripp's perfectionism, I would say. So when it comes to the great to crap ratio, obviously King Crimson get the point, and it's to Yes. Right, so we are now to the last final one, and it's down to me because the Superi-O-Meter I made, and I made it partially out of my DNA. Don't tell anybody, but that was the way. I don't want to tell how it works. I've patented it because I know that when all the other music YouTubers see this idea of the Superi-O-Meter, they're all going to want it. So Rick Beato, if you're watching this, any of you, Adam Neely, you're going to go, oh my God, Andy's had a good idea there. And you'll try and steal it. Well, you cannot steal it because it's mine and I've patented it, right? And it contains my DNA. It won't work without your DNA. And this last parameter is based upon my personal taste. Yes, it's my channel, it's my video, it's my Superi-O-Meter. It's only taken up 10% of the judgment, but I think that's important. So when we feed it in, right, my personal taste, actually, when it comes to these two bands, and I've had a big think about it, I love both of these bands exactly the same. I can't split them up. Right, normally I could. Normally I would I absolutely love King Crimson. I absolutely love Yes. I could not live without these two bands. I love them both. So it's 0.5. So we now have got all the information into the Superi-O-Meter, and now the Superi-O-Meter, with its huge calculating power, will add those numbers up. So come on then. Come on, add. Go. Ooh. Bit of steam coming out. We don't like the sound of that. Come on, you can do it. Come on, come on. Oh. There we go. So it's a draw. 5 points each. So the Superi-O-Meter has declared objectively, and this cannot be questioned. All the other YouTuber videos are going to do your ranking videos. Forget it. It's over. I have now put you all out of work because I now have a machine that can definitively work out what's better from one thing to the next. I've done it, here it is. And Yes and Genesis are exactly the same goodness. Exactly the same goodness, which you know is true. Any of you watching this know it's true. Now, I'm sure you're all going to run down to the comments and go, no, Yes is the best one. And the next person will go, no, King Crimson's the best one. And then someone will go, no, Yes is the best one. And then someone will go, no, King Crimson's the best one. And 140 comments later, no, Yes is the best one. No, King Crimson is the best one. All the way down the thing, right? And you'll all have your reasons. And it'll all because you're based upon your personal opinion. Because you haven't got a SUPERI-O-METER. And you're not having it. This is the only one I've made because it's a dangerous item. I can feed in political parties, religions into this, and it will tell you which one's the best. I can feed it in. This is an objective thing that can work out the goodness of absolutely anything. And then we could do it to people, couldn't we? You could do it to you and your wife. Say if you've been having an argument, you can just put it all into this, feed it in, and someone's going to come out the winner. And that's a dangerous thing. So I'm keeping it under wraps. And I promise you, I will only use it in progressive or jazz rock situations. I might push the boundaries. I've been thinking of the bands I could do with this. I think the next two we're definitely going to be, I think I'm going to do Mavish Orchestra versus Weather Report. I know who's going to win that. And I'm also going to do Led Zeppelin versus the Beatles. Or I could do the Beatles versus the Stones, but I hate the Stones. Sorry, Gimme Shelter, Masterpiece. You know, there's certain songs I like, but you know, I love the Beatles, not ski on the Stones. Surprising, I would have thought I'd be a Rolling Stones kind of guy, but I'm not. I'm a Beatles guy. But anyway, Led Zeppelin and the Beatles, which are two of the sort of perceived as the two greatest, biggest bands of all time. I might feed those in. So if you're excited about that, I want to see the SUPERI-O-METER used again. Put it in the comments, and any bands you want me to compare, I will compare, right? And I'll feed them in and we'll see what we get. Okay, so you put your suggestions in the comments. This idea I've had here, this is the best YouTube idea I've ever had. It does everything. I can be serious and funny at the same time. It plugs into that conflict that people like to see on YouTube. Right? It's completely can never run out. I can never run out. I can put one band against the next band. You know, 4 years' time, you know, I could be putting Mogul Thrash up against The Residents. No one will watch that video. Anyway, so, done it. Right, so that's the end of the video, but it's not, because I'm now going to talk about Yes and King Crimson seriously. So I'm going to shut down the SUPERI-O-METER. There we go, that's shut down. So, why did I compare these two bands? Well, one of the reasons is because they share a musician. They share the drummer, Bill Bruford. So, Bill Bruford, on a gig where King Crimson were opening up for them, had a conversation with Robert Fripp after the gig, and he says, you know, when you get back to the UK, why don't we have a meet up and a chat? And from that little conversation, we saw Bruford move from the headline band down to King Crimson. Now, why did he do that? And I think it's because King Crimson sat above Yes as a sort of in a sort of hierarchical role. Now, what do I mean by that? When King Crimson came out in 1969, it shocked the music world. Jimi Hendrix went to see them live, and he was sat in the audience, and he turned around to the lady next to him and said, "This is the greatest band on the planet," or something, words to that effect. They took everybody out. There's very few examples where a band comes out and pretty much defines the genre. This is why it's really hard when you talk about the beginnings of progressive rock to give bands like the Moody Blues or the Nice or early Soft Machine the credit you want, because they were all doing proggy things and they all had an influence, but the actual sound that we associate as progressive rock was defined by King Crimson on that first album, to such an extent that it's created a thing that happens in the progressive rock world where it's all about defining what progressive rock is. Now, progressive should be that you're pushing the boundaries, experimenting, pushing the envelope of rock music. That's what it should be. But it's come to mean a certain set of things, and all those things were pretty much done in the court of the Crimson King. Now, if we think back then, King Crimson were like opening up for the Rolling Stones in Hyde Park. They were getting a lot of coverage. A lot of people knew about this band. they had a lot of success with that first album, like I said. And John Anderson and Chris Squire saw them, and it was such an incredible sort of mind-blowing experience for them that it changed their trajectory. Now, if we take someone like John Anderson is the same age as Robert Fripp. They were both born in 1944. And it's arguable that John Anderson was actually on the scene in London before Robert Fripp. I'm not sure on that, but I'm pretty sure. We can go back and see videos of John Anderson performing in bands pre-Yes, which were big enough to be filmed. So he was obviously in that London scene. Fripp comes in, they're the same age. So this is a contemporary. When King Crimson do their thing and John Anderson sees this, that is the key to the puzzle, right? Once they change their direction, right, and we see that the first Yes album is almost like the Beatles. It's like you've taken the Beatles, you've got those vocal harmonies, there's a bit of the Byrds, there's a lot of that West Coast sound, and it's sort of an English version of that. That was very big thing at that time in the 60s scene in the UK. Then Time and the Word and the Yes album, we see them changing, you know, and by the Yes album they've created a new sound, and the addition of Steve Howe, who had also been in a band called Tomorrow and had also seen King Crimson and been really impressed. Now, when they were looking for a guitarist and Steve Howe came into the band, John Anderson at that time had performed in 1970 on the album Lizard. And the name escapes me. It's something like The Prince of something, I can't remember the title. And at that point, he asks Robert Fripp if he wanted to come and join the band, and I assume Robert Fripp didn't because his vision was his own band and he didn't want to be a sideman in Yes, although there would have been the ability to do your own thing, which Steve Howe then did. So that's interesting that they were trying to bring Fripp across into Yes. They're trying to take from King Crimson that thing that they've got. When Yes do it, it's arguable that they do it better in terms of commercial appeal. If we look at the epics on Lizard and Islands and all that stuff, and then we look at when Yes do it, it becomes one of the biggest things on the planet. And Yes are responsible for record companies supporting bands doing bonkers things, right? So it's arguable that, you know, labels like Virgin Records putting money into someone like Mike Oldfield to make a track with just 2 tracks on it, and then that going on to sell like 20 million albums or whatever it is. This was a glory period. There were 2 glory periods in the 70s in terms of creative music, I think. There was the progressive rock era in the UK, and there was a jazz rock era in the 70s in America, and they produced some incredible music. And it's why I do this channel, because there are incredible musicians around today, but they do not have the support and the budgets. So you will never get an album like Tales from Topographic Oceans coming out with a major label with the push that comes behind it. And that's why it's important to look at what was going on here between these 2 bands. This isn't just, oh, this is interesting because we like the 2 bands. By telling this story, we can actually see the mechanism which gets prog going, you know. So after In the Court of the Crimson King, we get Wake of Poseidon, which is an absolutely fantastic album. It's like, it's a great album, but it pretty much does what they did on the first album. We don't see the same cosmic leap forward, and I think that maybe affected King Crimson. They become very experimental. They're bringing in sort of free improvisation musicians. They're also bringing classical musicians, classical instrumentation. They're really pushing. They're doing everything a progressive rock band should do, but they're not that successful. And as I said earlier, they find themselves having to go and tour to support bigger bands. And they did this twice with Yes, I think maybe in 1971 and 72. And 72 is the point where Bill Bruford goes up and says, I want to join the band. Now, he said that the reason he joined King Crimson is he saw Yes as being the Beach Boys, and he saw King Crimson as being the John Coltrane Quartet. And I think that's a little bit unfair. And it's interesting because once he's gone, and Rick Wakeman's gone after Tales of Topographic Oceans, Relaya in 74 almost starts to follow suit a little bit of what King Crimson had done in 72. So there's this argument that yes, we're drawing a lot from King Crimson, but they were able to do it in a way that was more accessible. Okay, and I think a lot of that is down to the genius of John Anderson's voice and his ability to create absolutely beautiful melodies, and to have a voice which becomes the sound of Yes. I know that's very contentious, you know. Obviously, if you then get rid of John Anderson and you bring in another singer, they're either not going to sound like John Anderson, so it's not Yes, or they're going to sound like John Anderson, and then it is essentially a tribute band. And I think this is Yes's great downfall. Fripp realised in '72 that the progressive rock concept was over, and he restructured the band into the John Wetton Band. And I think the Larks, Tongues in Aspic, Stars of the Bible Black and Red, those 3 albums are more important than In the Court of the Crimson King. It changes all of music, you know. So when we think of somebody like Kurt Cobain, you know, putting together Nirvana with a lot of punk influences, the thing that really pushes Nirvana over the edge so it doesn't sound like a punk band is Kurt Cobain's love of the album Red. The darkness, the gothicness, the heaviness, which has influenced so many bands after that, you know. If you listen to a band like Tool, totally coming out of that period of King Crimson. If we think of a band like Primus, they're coming out of that period of King Crimson. So they really innovate. Fripp then goes on to do all these stellar session jobs in the late 70s, like playing guitar on Heroes for David Bowie. So he has his mainstream success, but as a sort of distant observer, Fripp has said in interviews that he was happy to be mid-league, right? Because being mid-league, he's been able to creatively do whatever he wants to do. And he says in this interview, if you're someone like a David Bowie, then that fame definitely constrains you. Some of you may know, because I mention it a lot and I always get criticised for mentioning it, but I did play for Robert Plant. And Robert is really constrained to a certain extent by the legacy of Led Zeppelin. These things that he did when he was 23 years old, 50 years ago, and now being brought up, and he has to, he has to be compared and live up to those things he did 50 years ago. And I don't think it was till Robert did the album with Alison Krauss that he was able to really redefine himself in his own terms. Robert Fripp, being in that sort of mid-league of players, has been able to continually do that. And so when they reformed King Crimson in the 80s, King Crimson is the great artistic achievement for progressive rock in the 1980s. Whereas Yes, and I love 90125, but that is the great commercial moment, along with Aisha, you know. So Steve Howe and John Anderson, and you know, they both go on to create something out of progressive rock that is really, really commercial. And I've argued on this channel many a time that, especially here in the UK, the great pop artists that came out in the 80s had far more in their DNA from progressive rock than they did from punk. They had a basic attitude to keep things simple, and that was about it. But when you listen to those early 80s pop artists like ABC, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, it's prog, right? But what you don't get is the fiddly widdly toodly widdly, and you don't get the fairies and the elves and the Tolkien-esque imagery. But there's still great concepts. There's still the use of technology. Frankie Goes to Hollywood, the Welcome to the Pleasure Dome track is 20 minutes long and it's got Steve Howe on it. I mean, is that not prog? So the legacy of both these bands are incredible. King Crimson and Robert Fripp have continually reinvented themselves, and Robert Fripp will be 80 next year. And over the last year, he has reinvented himself again as a YouTuber with his wife, Toya Wilcox. He has been very canny to be able to utilise the assets of people around him, musicians around him, to focus himself, you know, like from when he was started and hanging out with Blondie and Talking Heads and that whole new wave thing that he did in the 70s, when they came back with thrash in the 80s, and his ability to take on that sort of thrash metal aesthetic that was going on. And now the assets that he's taken from Toya Wilcox, I wonder what they would be. I don't know. Put it in the comments down below. but he's a good asset manager. He looks like an asset manager. He's never looked like a rock star, has he, Fripp? He's always looked like an asset manager. I am now going to tell you a little thing. I emailed Robert Fripp. Robert Fripp doesn't live too far away from me. He's I won't say where he is, but he's quite close to me. And one of my students was actually playing for a very short while with Toya Wilcox, and so she was in the Fripp household, actually communing with this giant. And I thought, well, he's only up the road, so I emailed him the other day to do an interview on my wonderful channel here, and he declined me. And he declined me in very, very polite way. Right. In fact, I'll read the email out to you, because I haven't got the big scoop I wanted. I haven't got Robert Fripp on the channel. I was all ready to go down. I was going to film it properly with a camera crew and everything. I would have done a good job. I don't think he's been fair, really. I mean, I've bought enough of his bloody albums over the years, so I'm going to go into my emails now and see if I can find it. This isn't going to work, but I'll read you out my message from Robert Fripp's secretary or personal manager, whoever it is. So I'm just going to go to my emails now. I might edit some of this out, because I have got I've got a little, you might have noticed my production values have gone up a little bit, haven't they? Right, so let's have a look. So I'm going to put Robert Fripp into my search, and I'll read you out what it says. Here we go. So I will read you what I wrote. This is what I wrote to Robert Fripp. I put, "Hello, Mr. Fripp." I thought that was a good way of starting. I'm a musician based in, well, I've said my town, I'm sure you can work it out. I am currently playing drums with Tim Bowness. Now, Tim Bowness is in the band No Man with Steve Wilson, and he's got contacts with Fripp. So I'm straight away sort of saying, like, I'm sort of, I'm connected with you in a very vague way, you know, and I thought that was a good way to start. I'm not a psycho. I have achieved some degree of notoriety in the world of progressive rock. So, right, so, and then here I go. I've also played with Robert Plant, IQ and Frost for a number of years. In other words, I'm a musician. I'm also a YouTuber with a small but dedicated following. Hello, small but dedicated following. How are you today, small but dedicated following? Where am I? I discuss music and how it relates to history. Oh, there's so many spelling mistakes. He must think I discuss music, but who it relates. It should have been how. This is why he hasn't answered me. He's not going to answer someone who hasn't got the basic grasp of grammar. Oh, why didn't you spell check it? Right. I discuss music, but how it relates to history, culture, and also the philosophy behind the creative process. I didn't mention the fact that I do videos about, you know, who's got the best moustache in progressive rock, or what the best biscuit is. Maybe I should have done that. Maybe it was the wrong approach. As a younger man, I explored the teachings of Gurdjieff, which I did, and I am interested in the esoteric and exoteric aspects of music. So, of course, I have for many years been a fan of your work. See, that's right. I'm really kissing his bottom now. This is Fripp bottom kissing at its best. I am contacting you in the hope you would agree to be filmed for an interview for my YouTube. I'm not interested in discussing rock and roll stories or the ins and outs of the music business. I would like to discuss the philosophy of your creative process and the relation of music to the utility of aesthetics in history and the development of our species with reference to the esoteric. I sound like a knob. I hope the proposition is of interest for you. I need to read these emails out loud. Yeah, that wasn't. Now I've reread it. It wasn't the best approach, was it? Wasn't the best approach, right? So I now have an email back from the secretary to Robert Fripp, and it says, "Dear Andrew," and I like the fact that I'm Andy Edwards. I've signed it Andy Edwards, and the representative, Mr. Fripp, has rightly longened my name to Andrew, like my mom would. And straight away, I'm listening. As soon as that happens, I'm going to listen to what they say, because I've been called Andrew. If you want to really get my attention, call me Andrew. I'm like, oh my God, I'm being called Andrew. Then she's put, RF is currently on tour, and I assume RF stands for Robert Fripp, and respectfully declines your invitation with best wishes. Thank you for your interest. All the best. So I didn't get much out of him, but I have, by proxy, receive the best wishes of Robert Fripp. Now, if anybody connected to Robert Fripp's watching this video, you're going to go and say, look, Robert, go and watch this video, and he's going to watch it, and he's going to realise that I am not just a big pretentious name-dropping fool, right? That I have actually got a bit of a sort of sense of humour, and I'm just trying to cover my tracks now, and I feel bad. I should have read it out. I'm usually quite good at this sort of thing. I think Robert Fripp's whole demeanour I find a little bit intimidating. I wasn't looking forward to the prospect of doing that interview anyway. I think he could be very difficult. He could be difficult, and I don't know how I would. I don't know how I'd act on the receiving end of sort of that Fripp difficulty. But then he could be very gracious, because he is both those things at once. He always seems to have a very wry sense of humour. Fripp does. A sort of sense of humour which I think I may have got from Robert Fripp, and I do the same sort of very dry delivery, which underlying is just taking the mickey out of the whole thing. And at the end of this video, all of you have got to the end of this video, please remember that when I do things like who's the best and who's not, it's not real. It's not real, okay? What it is, this is entertainment. And if you like these bands, it's interesting to explore which one's the best, because we get a bit better understanding of what they do, and I think that's very important. And I think fundamentally that is the nature of art. Right, I'm at the end of the video. I'm really chuffed with this one. I do a number of things on this channel, and this format has enabled me to do all of them at the same time. Be very serious, be silly, look at the cultural context, discuss the nature of what music is, and have a little bit of a laugh. So I'm quite happy with this. If you like this format, I think this is going to go down really well. I'm just worried about that Rick Beato watching me. He's secretly watching me. Rick, if you're watching me right now, you're not having this. You can have it. You can have this idea, right? And I'll let you use the SUPERI-O-METER. I'll come on your show and I will operate it, because I'm not having you operating it, right? I'm not having it. You might know all your music theory. You might know all about, all your Steely Dan guitar solos, note for note and all that. You might have all that down, but I'm not letting you get your little jazz fingers on my SUPERI-O-METER. No way. It's reserved for my jazz fingers. They might not be as good as your jazz fingers. They might not. But I've done this a lot today, haven't I? I think it's the thought of toy as assets. Anyway, I'm going to go now. I'm going now. So if you like this video, like the video. If you want to see more, you can subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell. And you're going to want to, because you're going to want to see the next SUPERI-O-METER use, aren't you? You're going to want that. And if you want to support me, please go over to patrons. My patrons are involved in all sorts of ways with this channel. Doran, who is a very loyal patron, was part of a major video on the channel where we looked at Pink Floyd. He wasn't just brought on to sort of patronise him, even though it is patron, and I should be patronising them because the definition of what I'm doing, so maybe I was patronising him. But I didn't mean to patronise him in a patronising way, in a negative patronising way, but I was patronising him in a positive way. So if you want to be patronised in a positive way as well, then go over to my Patreon, the link's in there, and you can go there and you can get it for 7 days for free. So you can have a look at all the stuff there, and then you don't have to pay me, you can go away. And hopefully once you've gone, you will sit there in a miserable depression when you realise suddenly that a little jigsaw puzzle in your life that was filled by my wonderful patron is now empty, and that emptiness will drive you to part with money and send it to me because I want it. Done. Finished. See you on the next one. Bye.